Now, let me ask the question again. Would you please type yes to give your consent to having this webinar recorded today, please? Great. Thank you, everybody. That's super. Okay. Hello, everyone, and thank you, of course, for coming to this webinar session brought to you by BELTA with the support of Heike Phillip of Let's Talk Online. My name is John Arnold, a board member and the event officer for BELTA, the Belgian Language Teachers Association. BELTA's aim is to encourage professional development through bringing English language professionals in Belgium together with themselves or with the world to discuss the things that matter to them. We also want to connect Belgian teachers to the wider world of ELT. And that's why we offer these webinar series, our Sunday with BELTA. So we can bring our members together with professionals like Hugh Dellar from across the world who have great information to share with us. So a big hello to all of our members. Hello to everybody who's joining us from around the world. And a special hello to all my students who are here today. I appreciate them giving up their Sunday afternoon to be with us. Before I introduce this month's speaker, I'd just like to remind all the BELTA members and the wider audience that our BELTA Day is coming up on the 22nd of March in Brussels. If you want more information about our BELTA Day and check out our great lineup of speakers, please go to our website, www.beltabelgium.com, which is listed below in the box with all the Twitter handles, the YouTube handles, and the websites. Okay, let's get to the more important piece. Hugh Dellar here today. So Hugh Dellar, who's joining us today, he's going to discuss the 5 golden rules associated with the lexical approach. Hugh Dellar is a teacher and a teacher trainer at the University of Westminster. He has been teaching since 1993, predominantly in London, but spent 3 years in Jakarta, Indonesia. He gives teacher training and development talks all over the world. He is the co-author of the Outcomes and Innovation series, and many of us who use this series were talking about it earlier in the chat room and how much we love it. He also teaches the online development course, Teaching Lexically. He is currently working on a methodology book for Delta, also entitled Teaching Lexically, as well as a second edition of Outcomes and some ELT apps. He blogs sporadically at www.hughdellar.wordpress.com, also listed below. In addition, Hugh will be presenting at the 48th Annual IATEFL Conference this year. His presentation is called 20 Things in 20 Years. Now, before I ask Hugh to start, I forgot to mention that there's a Q&A box underneath the slides. If you have a question, if you remember, please type it in that Q&A box, and hopefully Hugh will be able to address your questions at the end of the presentation. If you type it in the chat room, I'll try to move it over to the Q&A box. Okay, without further ado, I'll turn it over to Hugh. Thank you for being here, Hugh. We're all looking forward to your presentation today.
Thank you. And I guess I should begin by thanking everyone at BELTA for giving me the chance to be here and talking to everybody. Very, very nice to be asked to do so. Thank you also to all the participants who have given up your Sunday afternoons for some masochistic reason to be here with me. Okay, yeah, 5 golden rules of lexical teaching. I should really begin by saying that, you know, these aren't the 5 golden rules. They're my 5 golden rules, if you like. And I should also kind of begin by saying that, in a way, this book here, where is it? My well-thumbed copy, there it is. In many ways, it kind of ruined my life for at least a couple of years. When I first read The Lexical Approach, and I don't know how many of you have, if you haven't, you should. If you have, then probably it will have had some impact on your thinking. When I first read it, I think, which was back in 1995, so, you know, getting on for 20 years ago now, when I did my Delta, one of the things that really struck me about it was the fact that it seemed to me in many ways to be a really kind of revolutionary document. It seemed to be suggesting that we kind of tear up a lot of the way we were doing things. But actually it was sort of dressed up in this very placatory kind of ameliorating sort of language where Michael Lewis kept promising, this is all just stuff you can bolt on to what you're doing already. None of this implies any kind of major sea change. And really for me, this wasn't the case. As I struggled to get my head round the central idea really of the lexical approach, which for me is it's an approach to language, and it's an approach to the way we think about the nature of language, and as a result, the way we think about what's important to do in the classroom as language teachers. And right at the crux of all of that is this sort of dichotomy that, you know, language is not lexicalized grammar, it is rather grammaticalized lexis. And as I struggled to get my head around this, it took me a long time. You know, I used to wake up in a cold sweat in the middle of the night, sort of panicking, going, oh, what was it again? Was it lexicalized grammar or grammaticalized lexis? And slowly, I think, I started to kind of move away from the way I'd been trained to teach and the way I'd been trained to think about language. And I started to move towards what has become for me a kind of lexically rooted pedagogy. And as I did this, I guess, and as something resembling some kind of lexical pedagogy emerged out of the carnage that first ensued when I read the lexical approach, I started to realize the wisdom of playing down change, of sort of revolution by numbers, if you like. And hopefully this talk today, this session we're going to do, will bring you some of the fruits of these labors in kind of easy to eat, easy to digest, bite-sized pieces. You will have seen that the title was 5 Golden Rules of Lexical Teaching, but I should really begin by making it clear that I'm not saying all of these are needed. I'm not saying that, you know, if you're not doing any of these things, you're a terrible teacher. And I think in a way, you know, any one of the things I'm talking about today makes for better teaching. Okay? So, golden rule number 1, first up. Possibly being a coursebook writer as well as a teacher, you might expect me to say this. You may even think it's cynical of me to say this, but I think in a way, if you're looking to teach from a lexical point of view, life is much easier if you're using lexical material. And I think it's hard still. I don't think there's a huge amount of lexically focused, lexically rooted material out there. I think what has happened in the last 20 years is a lot of mainstream course books have kind of bolted on a sort of additional lexical syllabus, or started to pay a little bit more attention to co-text and to collocation and this kind of thing. For me, it's better than nothing. It's an improvement on what we had maybe 20 years ago, but it doesn't go far enough. For me, really, lexical materials simply means using materials which are rich in language which is useful for your students. In essence, materials which expose your students to a lot of useful lexis. And if you accept this, and if you think this is a good idea, I think it actually has some profound implications for the classroom. And I think one implication is particularly at pre-advanced levels, okay? It basically means less authentic texts. In many ways, I think this whole argument about what is authentic and what is inauthentic in the classroom, it's been going on for a long time. Back in the 1980s, Widdowson was already talking about how, you know, it's a sort of falsely named premise to call something authentic just because native speakers use it. It's not authentic for the language classroom, and that for the language classroom, a text needs to be authenticated, if you like. For me, I just think that authentic texts aren't always the most useful things to students. It may be where we want students to get to in the long run, but, you know, the destination is not the journey. The road is not the final point of arrival. And I think in terms of listenings, one of the problems for students is often that they don't hear in the classroom and in course books enough everyday conversation enough interactional kind of speech, enough models of conversation which resemble the kinds of conversations they might want to have themselves. I first started thinking about this when I was living in Indonesia, and I was picking up Indonesian outside of the classroom. I was speaking Indonesian as much as I could. I was hanging out with Indonesians and with expats who spoke Indonesian. And quite quickly I became quite fluent, quite competent. And my students, even though they'd been studying English much longer than I'd been studying Indonesian, hadn't developed this kind of competence. And I think part of the problem I came to realise was that the listenings we were doing in the course books were often these lengthy, often fairly tedious kind of transactional information giving listenings. So, you know, they'd do a 6-minute listening about a French guy who ate every part of an airplane, for example. And then we'd wonder why, you know, they weren't able to have proper conversations about what they did last weekend. And I think it's often just because they don't have those models, they don't have access to that. I think another problem, particularly when I started out teaching, was there were a lot of authentic texts brought into, so-called authentic texts, brought into classrooms and into course books. And often they contained a lot of really obscure, relatively useless vocabulary. And also often they were sort of supposedly interesting, but actually there wasn't much to say about them. One text that I remember doing years ago was called Mysteries of the Universe, which, you know, sounds very grand and mysterious and universal. But the pre-reading task was things like, you know, where does rain come from? Why is the sky blue? How far away is the moon? And the students would basically kind of go, rain comes from the sky. The sky's blue because it's not green. The moon, far away. They would read the text and then they would discuss what they'd learned. And they would say things like, oh, the moon, 76,382 miles away. Blimey, the things you learn. And it just wasn't very interesting, actually. So I think, actually, it's better if we're using texts which are written for the language classroom. They're written to stimulate discussion and stimulate debate. And they're written in such a way that the language is carefully graded in terms of the level, in terms of the frequency, in terms of the reusability, the surrender value to the students of the input that they're being given. I think in order to supplement this, what we need to then do is to, once we have these texts in the classroom, which are rich in useful language, we need to be exploiting them through lexically oriented language exercises. Of course, this can mean words. Yeah, you know, students need to learn words. Also need to learn lots and lots and lots and lots of collocations, you know, which verbs and which adjectives collocate with which nouns. And at lower levels, I guess, particularly, they need to learn how the most common verbs and adjectives and nouns in the language collocate. They also need to be learning lots of fixed and semi-fixed expressions. I think one thing that's come up over the last 2 decades, really, as a result of corpora-based research, is the fact that a huge amount of everyday language, both spoken and written, actually, is much more formulaic and much more predictable than maybe we'd previously imagined. A lot of language that we use on a day-to-day basis comes fully grammaticalized, fully formed, if you like, and it can be learned and reused wholesale. If you think about the language that we know just between us here, okay, we know thousands, tens of thousands of these kinds of chunks. Just things like, you know, you'll have to wait and see. I'd rather not. It's a waste of time. They should be held to account. How should I know? I'd best be off. You know, it's an accident waiting to happen. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of these chunks that we use on a daily basis. Yeah, you know, as someone's just pointed out. And without them, we couldn't function in day-to-day speech because we'd have to be inventing everything using, you know, single words plus grammar, which isn't how it really works. For me also, a lexical approach, particularly to general English, okay, means first and foremost teaching students to speak, okay, and worrying more about the spoken language. Partly because of the percentage of time that students will spend speaking and listening, as opposed to reading and writing. Partly because most of the most frequent words are so frequent because they're so common in spoken language. And as such, I think we need to be paying maybe more attention to spoken grammar, which is a different kind of beast to the traditional kind of more written, more sentence-based grammar that we've often worried about. You just think about things like, I don't know, I didn't get home until 3. We didn't wake up until 6 in the evening. That's grammar where you're marking a kind of later than usualness by using not until, but it's not grammar as we often teach it. When you say things like, I was so tired, I fell asleep on the sofa in the middle of the movie. It was so cold, my hands felt like they were going to fall off. That's also grammar, so plus an adjective plus a result clause. That's very common in spoken English, but you don't often see that kind of thing in classroom material. A quick brain teaser for you, if you can type in your own answers here very quickly, okay? What percentage of all verb tense usage do you think is in the present or past simple? Okay, in both spoken and written English. What percentage of the time when we're choosing a verb tense do you think we just use present or past simple? Go on, I'll give you a minute to see some guesses. 70, it's a popular number. 90, 80, oh, look at that. So Natasha, by splitting the difference, you get the correct answer. Basically, about 80% of the time when we're choosing verb tenses, we're using the present simple or the past simple, okay? About 1% of the time, we're using the present perfect continuous. Logically, what this means is that, 80% of the time we're worrying about grammar in class, it should just be those two tenses. But really, there's almost nothing to say about it in terms of grammar. The present simple, it's quite simple. It's generally in the present. There's a third person S. Past simple, it's also quite simple. It's in the past. Learn the irregulars. I think what it means is, actually, in most classes, we should be spending less time on tenses and kind of worrying about things like the future perfect continuous and the past perfect continuous. And we should be worrying much more about grammar as lexis, okay? So things like, do and go are irregular verbs in the past tense. Just knowing this doesn't really help you say anything. You can say, I did, really, I went. Good. What you need to do is to kind of learn how to use go and went and really any other language with its collocates, with the grammar that it's often used with and its collocates. So, you need to use things like I went on a date, I went clubbing, I went away for the weekend, I went out for dinner, I went for a walk around the block. I did a bit of work, I did some shopping, I did my washing, I did some stuff for work. Unless you know how to use those irregular verbs as part and parcel of lexical bundles, you basically can't do anything with them. So I think we need to have a greater emphasis on grammar as lexis. Also at lower levels, I think students can learn the most common chunks or sentences using supposedly high frequency vocabulary, and they can use them competently without necessarily understanding more about the grammar. So they can learn how to say things like, how long have you been doing that? Before they learn the present perfect as a concept or as a structure. They can just learn that as a chunk, as a piece of lexis. Just like when they have their very first lesson ever, they learn what's your name as a chunk. They don't learn that in a kind of analytical sort of way. So I think more of that is a good thing. So before you become suspicious that this is a book tout indirectly, I should move on. The second golden rule that I would suggest is really to do with developing linguistic awareness. And in some ways, this is why it's important that you have very lexically oriented material, because the more lexical the material is, the more opportunity there is for a teacher to draw students' attention to and to encourage them to notice strange little lexico-grammatical features of the language. I think all too often, a lot of students, and sadly still some teachers, come to the classroom with this belief that a second language basically equals grammar plus single words. And as a result, you get endless word-for-word translation. You get students who become kind of word blind. They'll encounter a compound noun like personal column, and they'll just look up the word column. Or they'll find housing estate, and they just look up the word estate, because they're sort of very focused on the individual items that they're not sure of the meaning of. And I think we need to challenge this. We need to encourage students to take more notice of collocation. We need to make sure students learn typical ways of saying things. We need to have discussions with our students about the dangers of word-for-word translation and the importance, excuse me, of kind of translating chunks. In a way, this is a kind of ongoing war of attrition where you're constantly trying to sort of wear students down and reprogram the way that they're thinking about language and looking at language. One of the ways we can do this is through board work. And I guess one of the ways I've changed as a teacher is by placing much more stress and much more importance on the board work, looking at the board work as a way of priming or conditioning students to expect language to work in certain kinds of ways. So I'm no longer just writing up single words. I'm certainly not writing up definitions. I'm basically writing up examples of usage. So instead of teaching, day trip or even to go on a day trip, now I'll basically explain, if you go on a day trip, you leave where you live in the morning, you go somewhere to visit, you come back in the evening. For example, I'm going on a day trip to this Saturday. I might give one example. I might say, so, for me this weekend, I'm going on a day trip to Brighton with my wife and kids. Any other places you can go on a day trip to? And in the past, that's right, I went on a day trip too. So just doing this, you're constantly kind of bridging that gap between grammar and vocabulary and teaching the grammar and the vocabulary at the same time. Yeah? I think other ways we can foster awareness are by doing things like when students are reading, instead of just sitting back and leaving them, watch what they're doing, watch what they're underlining. Go around, point out, yeah, you've just underlined estate. Actually here, it's housing estate. Here, you've just underlined column. Actually, it's placed an advert in a personal column. They met through an advert in a personal column. So that you're constantly kind of, a bit like teaching kids to cross the road, stop, look left, look right. Make sure you've seen all of the stuff that's around you rather than just focusing on what's directly in front of you. And, students have this kind of word blindness all the time. Recently, I was teaching a class, intermediate level, and the question, do you fancy going out somewhere tonight, came up. And one of the students had underlined the word fancy. And I was just about to say, it's not fancy, it's do you fancy going out somewhere tonight? And the student said, I understand this word fancy. It means very beautiful. Okay? So, this is what we're fighting time and time again. I think other things we can do is after we've done texts, whether they're reading texts or listening texts, we can get students to underline new collocations or expressions. Even better, I think, is us guiding this process and making our own, could be gap fill exercises. It could be, did you notice which verbs went with which nouns? Here are 8 adjectives from the text. Can you remember the nouns they were used with? Here are 8 verbs and 8 nouns from the text. Can you remember which ones they were used with? And it's a different kind of task to, is there any language you don't understand? Because here what you're doing is basically saying, not are there any words you don't know, but more, did you notice these useful bits of language? Okay, you read it, you digested the meaning, but were you paying attention? Yeah? And the students who really progress are the ones who either naturally or because we train them, notice more and pay more attention to the way the words work with other words. So, the third golden rule. This is really connected to the whole thorny issue of student error. Obviously, I think students make errors for all kinds of complex overlapping reasons. And error shouldn't be an excuse for punitive correction and more photocopied pages of Raymond Murphy's English grammar in use. I think instead, error should be seen as an opportunity for us as teachers to start from where our students are and to work outwards from there. And I think one of the reasons why students often make mistakes is because they haven't yet learned the collocations or the fixed expressions that they're looking for, which are the most concise, most condensed ways of saying things. And if this is the case, what then happens is they have to fall back on the kind of grammar plus words way of saying things. For example, a few years ago I was teaching, and one of the students had the first edition of the book and one of them had the second edition. And they noticed this because they were sharing and they had different pictures in the book. And one student said, your book is a new book which is similar with the my old book, but has been improved and more up to date. Now you could look at that and think that's a grammar mistake, okay? I look at that and think this is a student who doesn't know how to say, you have the revised edition. So for me, this is an opportunity not to correct grammar, but really to teach things like a revised edition, okay? And then maybe to teach, it's a remake of an old movie. It's a cover version of an old song. It's a revised edition of a book. And if you go into talking to students with this kind of mindset, where you're basically listening to what they're saying, trying to understand what they're saying, and thinking about whether or not there are more precise, condensed ways of saying what they're trying to say, what it means is you basically think that error is normal and natural and inevitable, and you essentially try to reformulate rather than correct a lot of the time. So what this means is when a student comes in and says, sorry, I didn't make my homework, all you do is to say, you didn't do your homework. Why not? If a student says, sorry, I'm late, I lost my bus, you say, don't worry, come in. Better late than never, but not lost. Anyone? That's right, I missed my bus. Same way, I missed my train, I missed my connection, I missed my flight. But, I've lost my keys. Have you seen them anywhere? I've lost my ID card. Have you seen it anywhere? The student who comes to class and said, sorry, I know come class last week, my mum, she broke the leg. You just say, no, your mum broke her leg. That's terrible. What happened? And I think if you're constantly giving students this kind of linguistic makeover, okay, what it means is they listen to you more, they pay a bit more attention, but it also allows you to treat them as a human being at the same time as giving them this linguistic makeover. I think a further implication is we should maybe not plan quite as psychotically enthusiastically as we're often encouraged to on training courses. And instead, we need to leave space to let some of the student interlanguage control the class more. Yeah, maybe, plan a little bit less, build in some slack time into the classes. What I find often happens is when you're explaining new vocabulary, students will often shout out the nearest equivalent word to the word you're teaching, okay? So, for example, it might be that you're teaching stressed out or stressed, and you're trying to explain something like, I'm really stressed out about it. You're explaining it and students will say, like nervous. Maybe for your students, they'll say an L1 equivalent as well, yeah? Excuse me. I think what we need to do in this situation is not just say, yes, it is similar, but we need to take a bit of time to explore the difference in terms of usage and in terms of collocation, okay? So instead of going, yes, it is like nervous, we need to basically say, yeah, it's similar. But usually, if you're stressed out, it's because you're really busy at work or really busy at college. Your job can be really stressful. You can ask the students, so what do you do? Wow, that must be really stressful. What kind of job can go here? The students will never say language teacher. They'll all say like surgeon, pilot, doctor. Fine, you take those answers. You can then look at how to use nervous. You know, usually nervous, it's before something. I always get really nervous before flying. You can ask them any other times you get nervous. They might ask you, can you say a person is nervous? You can say, yeah, a very nervous kind of person. They're always fidgeting. They never really seem to relax. And obviously doing this kind of teaching, it means more board work. It means more planning, thinking about how words are different to synonyms. It means doing away with the whole idea of explaining things by using synonyms, because, you know, it doesn't work. It basically only tells them a tiny part of the story. It means really helping students to see how what we're trying to give them connects to, but also differs from, what the students already have. Yeah? So, the fourth golden rule, the triple X rule. This is the sexy part of the talk. This is basically to do with, I guess you could call it concept checking of new vocabulary. And what it means is when we're dealing with new vocabulary in class, we need to explain the new vocabulary in the context in which it's being met. We need to exemplify it with the grammar, with the co-text it's often used with. And then if we can, we need to use the class to help us expand upon this. I think just trying to explain or just trying to translate meaning doesn't go far enough. Especially for words which are very similar. So things like, you know, worried, anxious, nervous, stressed out. Maybe when you translate those into L1, you've got one word for those. I'll give you an example of what I mean with this triple X rule. A couple of months ago, one of my pre-intermediate students came into class. Excuse me, I'm fending off the cold with a cup of tea. And she asked me, what does guilty mean? And I started sort of explaining the legal concept of guilty. And she said, no, I understand this. I mean here. And in the workbook, she had found this example of, I feel really guilty about it. So, you know, the first thing is she hasn't seen the whole context. Feel guilty is different from to be found guilty. So I said, okay, yeah, here it's not really guilty, it's feel guilty. And I gave a little story. You know, last year, I forgot my mum's birthday. It was terrible. She made me feel terrible about doing it. Afterwards, oh, I'm a bad son. I felt really guilty about it. And because we've done this grammar recently, I wish plus past perfect, I wrote up underneath, I feel really guilty about forgetting my mum's birthday. I wish I hadn't done it. So I've explained it. I've exemplified it with the grammar it's often used with. I then asked the group any other things you might feel guilty about. And, you know, they shout out a bunch of ideas. What you get from this is you end up with things like, I feel really guilty about eating that cake this morning. I feel really guilty about what I said to my boss. I wish I hadn't done it. What you also sometimes get is responses from students which show you that they haven't fully understood it, or they haven't understood the limits of the words. So this last time, one of my Japanese students said, losing his number. And I thought, I feel guilty about losing his number. Give me a bit more context here. And my student told this great story about going to a party, meeting this guy, swapping phone numbers. She then fell asleep on the night bus because she was drunk. She woke up, she'd missed her stop, she got off the bus. She realized she'd left her phone and her handbag on the bus, and now she'll never find the phone again, and she'll never, excuse me, she'll never be able to see him again. Great story, but not an example of feel guilty. As I was listening to it, I said, yeah, okay, so now I understand why you're always late on Monday mornings, Tomoko, but not guilty. I really regret losing his number. Now I'll never see him again. We had a couple of minutes talking about regret, and we elicited some other examples. So again, it's kind of working from the students, checking their understanding of it. It's asking questions about language to generate language, yeah? Because, you know, students need to do more than simply understand meaning. They need to know about collocation, the words which go with the words they're teaching. They need to know about colligation, the grammar and the grammar patterns that go with the words they're teaching. Just to give you one more idea, imagine you're doing a phrasal verb exercise and one of the answers is get kicked out of. When you're checking the answers, yeah, you can basically say, okay, number 3, that's right, kicked out of. So, you know, in this sentence, he was kicked out of the team because he was always late for training. Anything else you can be kicked out of, you know, and again, it's a way of checking if the students know how that word works. So you think about anything else you can be kicked out of. You can be kicked out of your house, kicked out of the country, kicked out of the school, kicked out of a restaurant, kicked out of a club or a bar. Who by? Well, you know, kicked out of your house could be by your landlord, could be by your wife or your husband, could be by your landlord, by your parents. Why? Well, it could be because you haven't paid your rent, could be because your wife or your husband's found out you've been cheating on them, could be because, you know, you're 35 and your parents think it's time you learned to stand on your own 2 feet. So by asking those kinds of questions, you use the class in a sort of interactive way. You look at the language and the grammar around the words you're teaching. And I think in many ways, the real art of teaching is being able to do this. It's basically about letting the exercise carry some of the weight. And then when you're teaching, you're filling in the gaps. You're exploring the language around the language that you're teaching. So finally, before we move on to the kind of Q&A section, if you like, I think that the last thing that's really important is students need to practice. Okay, I think ideally they need to do something personal with the language, but possibly they need to do almost anything with the language. Yeah, they just need to kind of use it in some way. I often think that, particularly at kind of pre-intermediate and elementary, if the students can't use the new language that they've been learning to say something personally meaningful, then maybe it's not very useful, that particular language. Obviously, there are lots of things that students can do with new language. They can rank the new vocabulary from 1 to 8, the ones they'd most like to remember, least like to remember, why. They can put verbs in chronological orders. They can tell little stories with them. They can use the words to talk about people that the words remind them of in their lives. My own personal favourite, and really I do this at the beginning of almost every lesson. Oh, excuse me. Is next lesson, go back to language that you taught or that you covered and exemplified and expanded upon in one class, and just do personal discussion about it next class. So, you know, imagine that the conversation we've just been having is a class. Tomorrow, I'll make these questions. We'll begin the day. I'll say, okay, read through the questions, check you understand them, anything you're not sure of. So, in pairs, has anyone you know ever been kicked out of anything? What? Why? Much better question, by the way, than have you ever been kicked out of anything? Because, you know, if they don't want to talk about personal experiences here, they don't have to. They might just say, oh yes, someone I know was once kicked out of a bar, and it might be about them, but they don't want to talk about it. If they want to talk about themselves, they'll still, you know, use their own stories here. When was the last time you went on a day trip? Where did you go? What was the last thing you felt guilty about? So basically, they're just, you know, they're taking the language that you've given them, that you've explained, that you've grammaticalized, that you've exemplified for them, and you're giving them the opportunity to connect that to their own lives and to make that personal. So, where are we? I've said earlier that it wasn't intended in any way to be a book tout, and I hope you'll agree that it hasn't been. Excuse me. Having said that, I think I should just finish really by saying that while I think any of the things I've been talking about do make for better teaching, and, you know, they are possible with whatever kind of material you're using, in a way, the reason that using lexical material is the first golden rule is simple for me. It's because if you follow it in many ways, the material itself should facilitate much else of what I've been talking about. So, you know, good material should really foster in our students greater awareness of how language actually works. It should contain whole sentence exemplifications of new language, not just synonyms, not just definitions. It should have meaningful, student-centered, personalized kind of practice contexts. And the rest, of course, I leave in your own capable hands. I think what I'll do now, if it's okay with you guys, is I'll switch to the Q&A. Excuse me. I can see some questions that have come in. You might have some other questions that you wanted to ask via the Q&A section. So what I'll do is I'll just address some of the questions and talk about some of the things. So Pat G got the first question in. Low levels, how to lexicalize when doing or working exercises hard. You know, in a way, for me, same way as you do with high levels, you're just lexicalizing easier language. You know, you think of a low-level vocabulary exercise. It may just be, I don't know, you're teaching, I don't know, think of something you might teach at an elementary class. You're teaching adjectives for describing places, okay? And it might be things like, you know, crowded, popular, expensive. All you do is you let the students try the exercises. When you're checking the answers, you might have written on the board, what was it like? And you just have on the board, it was very popular. Lots of people go there. It's very expensive. I can't afford to eat there. What was it like? It was really crowded. We couldn't get a table. Okay, so all you're doing is just adding little extra examples of grammar and vocabulary in combination that go together and that help the students to use those words at that level. Yeah. It also just means, I think, you know, every bit of vocabulary you're teaching at those low levels, thinking about typical sentences that those words might be used in, typical contexts they might be used in, and showing those students how to use those words in those kind of contexts. Yeah. There was a question from John Arnold, which is from Eileen Murphy. Can we use chunks they know from songs already as a basis for structure? You can try and use chunks they know from anywhere for structure. Okay. I think it depends what age they are. If you're teaching kids, songs work well, I think. With adults, I mean, part of the problem with songs is that the chunks you often find in songs are playful, creative uses of language which don't represent typical language. I'm in a band, and years ago when I first sort of got into being in a band, we used to go and tour Germany quite a lot. And I've got this great friend called Torsten, who's a Beatles fanatic from Hildesheim in Germany. And when I first met him, he used to say things like, yeah, Hugh, it's 3 o'clock, I'm going home now, I've had a very hard day's night. Or, this week I'm so tired because I have been working like a dog. I've worked 8 days this week. And when you tried to tell him, you know, it's not really English, he would get really sort of affronted and say, but John Lennon sang this. And, you know, songs are not normal uses of English. I think really what we need to be doing is starting by thinking about what the outcome of the lesson is going to be. What is it that we're presenting the grammar and the vocabulary for this class to help the students be able to do, instead of just taking random bits from songs or whatever. So, you know, if the goal is it's an elementary class and you want the students to be able to describe places better, what you're then doing is you're taking chunks to describe places. So you're having the question, what's it like? What was it like? You're having things like, you know, it was very crowded, it's very expensive, it's very cheap, it's good value for money. And, you know, maybe they know some of those chunks already just from reading, just from listening to English. Maybe they don't. Maybe they know some of the individual words which make up those chunks. And what you do is to help them to see how to put all that together. Yeah. So, you know, you can use chunks from songs, but my own feeling is it's not the most direct route. And it's not always the most useful or the most communicative, outcome-oriented way of doing things. So the next question I've got here is from Elizabeth, who asked, could you tell us more about the frequent use of the past simple? Yeah, basically just 80% of the time when we're choosing a verb tense, we use the present or the past simple. I saw an amazing talk at IATEFL a few years ago, and I wish I had a link for it because people always ask me about this. This researcher played an amazing interview with Kofi Annan and asked us to think about what level we would say it was. And, you know, of course, it was super advanced, yeah? They then said what grammar was being used in it. And actually, the only tense structure that Kofi Annan used in this whole talk was the present simple. You know, he was basically saying things like, the present situation is unsustainable as it stands. In order to tackle the perennial problems we face in this region, we need to integrate a variety of holistic approaches. You know, it was incredibly linguistically sophisticated, but grammatically, it was only using the present simple. And, you know, what the corpora research is showing us is that most of the time we use the present simple or the past simple. It isn't tense-based grammar that makes things complex or that makes things advanced. It's not like when you're an advanced student, you're suddenly using the past perfect continuous a lot more. You know, you're still using it 0.05% of the time, and you're still using the present simple and the past simple most of the time, because 80% of the time we talk about the past or about the present. Yeah, so that's that one. What's next? Pat G again. Reformulation on the spot can be difficult. Yeah, it can. It can. And, you know, we don't always get it right. Yeah. How can we get better at it? It's a really good question. I think there's 3 or 4 things. I think one thing is to do your homework before you're teaching. Okay. So when you're looking at what you're going to be teaching, you're thinking about what problems students might have. So that if you're going to be teaching things like stressed out, you're thinking about how that word works, what the limits of that word are, how it's different from other similar kinds of words. If you're looking at speaking exercises that students are going to do, you're thinking about what students might say, you're predicting typical kinds of answers, you're thinking about how those how you would answer those kind of questions. And by doing that, when you then hear students try to say things, you think, ah, yes, they're trying to say what I thought I might say in response to this, which is this. You can also just do it by, you know, taking your time and listening to them and thinking, yeah, okay, I know what you mean. I wouldn't say it like that. Personally, I would probably say it like this. You can also get better at it by talking about it with your colleagues, okay? Show your colleagues written work. Ask them, what do you think they mean here? How would you try to explain this? Yeah, just an example. Just before I came on air, one of my students sent me some homework, and it was called A Worst Journey, okay? A worst journey. So immediately I reformulate that, and I just write, well, either you can say a terrible journey, or you can say the worst journey ever, with a definite article. Okay, so I mean, often by really thinking about written work, actually, you get much better at thinking about what students are trying to say and, you know, being more conscious of those kinds of lexico-grammatical issues. And by discussing it with your colleagues and by being critical of your own reformulation. I think also, once you've done it once, it's easier to do again. Yeah. You know, when you've corrected something before, you have a little repertoire of language connected to your correction that you can recycle and that you can wheel out. So, what's next? Pat G again, hello. With elementary levels, when exemplifying or checking lexis, does their lower level not impede classroom exchanges? It's a really good question. Obviously it does, yeah? Especially in terms of what you expect them to produce, yeah? But even at low levels, you know, students can still produce often single word answers or single word responses. And what you can then do is to kind of help them grammaticalize that and, you know, place maybe more emphasis on just paying attention to and trying to use the chunks of language as they are. So say you want to teach the chunk, you know, how long have you been doing that? Okay, you can do that at elementary level. You need a context, so you need something like, I don't know, what are you doing tonight? I've got my Spanish class, I've got a yoga class, I've got a driving lesson. Okay? So you're basically teaching, what are you doing tonight, plus I've got, and some possible answers. You then teach, how long have you been doing that? You translate it, you explain. It means you, from the past to now, how long do? You then give some answers, not very long, quite a long time. They stand up, they walk around, they practice, they give a different thing they're doing every night. So, what are you doing tonight? I'm going to my Pilates class. How long have you been doing that? Not very long. What are you doing tonight? I've got an Arabic class. How long have you been doing that? Quite a long time. So, you're not going to get much more out of them than that, but they'll be able to have that particular exchange, that conversation, both fluently and accurately. And you can ask the students, what are you doing tonight? I've got a Spanish lesson, I've got a yoga class. Anything else I've got tonight? And see what comes up, see what works from them. Someone's just asked if there are handouts or slides available. I should just say, if anyone wants these slides or wants a handout for this, please just email me. It's hughdellar@mac.com. I'm happy to send out a written up version and send out the slides. So, Q&As. James Taylor, can you go into more detail regarding how a teacher can use this approach whilst using a course book that treats language as a collection of isolated words and phrases and grammar functions? Change your course book. Yeah, it's a really good question. At the moment, Andrew and myself, we're writing a methodology book for Delta Publishing called Teaching Lexically. And it's basically answering this question, which is, how can you still teach from a lexical point of view? Excuse me. How can you still teach from a lexical point of view if you are using a course book which just treats language as isolated words and grammar functions? I think the way that you're doing it, okay, the way that you can do it is, it's much more work for the teachers. Basically, what you have to do is, maybe say you take something like English file. Basically, English file treats language as single words with explanations, sometimes with synonyms. When you're going through the answers to those kind of exercises, what you then have to do is to say, and here's a typical example of how you might use this. When you're going through the grammar and you've got this kind of mad grammar, have you ever been to, yes, I have, no, I haven't. What you then have to do is to add the extra language. No, I haven't, but I'd like to. No, I haven't. I've never really wanted to. Yes, I have. I went there 6 years ago. Yes, I have. I tried it 6 weeks ago. So that basically, those kind of books leave the teacher a lot more work to do, because the teacher has to add the extra examples, has to add the context, has to use the board a lot more, has to use teacher talk a lot more to show the users how that language actually works. So it can be done, I think. And look out for our book next year, Teaching Lexically, for a whole slew of ideas on how to do this. 2 more questions, unless there's any more. From Jürgen, how do you make sure your course is not a loose list of collocations? Work thematically? Doesn't really fit with collocations. Yeah, it's another good question. I mean, I often think that, language learning, it's a bit like the Greek myth of Sisyphus, where life is basically one long punishment of pushing a rock eternally up a mountain. In a way, language learning is basically just adding one new chunk to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, in a never-ending, impossible to complete series of slow accumulation. I think in the classroom, the way you avoid that becoming too random, okay, is by, as I said, starting out by thinking about where you want to get to at the end of the lesson. When we're writing outcomes, what we try to do is to think about what is the communicative outcome we want students to achieve by the end of this particular lesson, and then to work backwards from there and to think about what grammar and what vocabulary might be useful in order for them to be able to do this. So it might be something like, upper intermediate class, today I want my students to get better at talking about the news. Okay? So think about how that works. What kind of conversations might they have? It might be a chunk. Did you see that thing in the news about? Did you read that thing in the papers about? You then need some language for describing things that they might have read about. You know, that murder, that terrorist attack in what's happening in Ukraine, what's happening in Venezuela. You might need some language for explaining those things in more detail. You know, no, what happened? Oh, it was awful. There was a drive-by shooting on Waterloo Bridge. Oh, it's awful. The police were going crazy and shooting people in the main square. Oh, it's awful. You know, you need to think about how those conversations develop. And it's not just collocations, it's the whole thing, how the grammar and the vocabulary interacts to help the students have those conversations. So you're presenting and encouraging the students to practice and learn and revising that language in the context of a bigger kind of communicative umbrella. So, 2 more questions. One from Werner. Your advice to avoid a lot of TTT for this idiomatic feedback, Hugh? I'm not sure my advice would be to avoid a lot of TTT. TTT is teaching. You know, if it's done properly, teacher talking time is what teachers use in order to teach, okay? And, you know, it's not just like it's me standing there lecturing. It's me going through the answers, eliciting ideas from students, checking. So, number 5, that's right, get kicked out of. If you get kicked out of something, you're asked to leave. So here you're kicked out of the team. Who else? What else can you be kicked out of? Then you're working from the students. Maybe you're clarifying that, you're rejecting some things, you're helping them. Who can you be kicked out by? You know, why might you be kicked out? It is teacher talking time, but it's in a dialogue with the class. It's 2-way. I'm using the students as a resource quite a lot. Yeah? Excuse me. And you know, I think that this fear of teacher talking time is an unhelpful kind of thing. For me, it's nothing to do with what percentage of teacher talking time is going on. It's to do with how useful is the teacher talking time, what's the teacher trying to achieve by talking, are the students getting plenty of opportunities to also talk, is it monologue or is it dialogue? And you know, that's much more sophisticated and much more complex way of thinking about TTT than just some kind of cold, hard percentage. So the last one, are we still teaching the lexical course? There's a few things. This is from Pat G. There is a National Geographic online course called Teaching Lexically. We don't actually teach it directly, but we wrote it. We will be, from this summer, doing a kind of language awareness, language development course that we're hoping to set up online, that I'll be advertising via Twitter and my blogs and via Facebook and everything. We also have this Teaching Lexically course book coming out next year. So nothing that I'm directly teaching at the moment, but we're hoping to have some stuff online by, you know, end of the year at the latest. So that's all the questions that I've had coming in. I haven't had time to read through everything that was up as I was talking. But if anyone else has anything they want to ask me now, please feel free. Type now or forever hold your peace.
I think you got them all, Hugh.
It's good to know.
I think everyone would agree with me that this has been a very informative session for experienced teachers and for some of the teacher trainers that were here as well. So that's great.
Thank you all for joining me.
So again, I'd like to thank Hugh for this session today. I know I'll be looking forward to your talk in IETFL in a few
Thank you.
weeks.
Hope to see you there.
Yeah, I can't wait.
I'm on the Saturday.
Yeah, on a Saturday. Why are you so late?
Apparently it's a compliment. They put you on the Saturday if they think you might have a possibility of pulling a few more extra people into the graveyard shift.
Okay. I'll make sure I stay for the whole thing then.
I'm not convinced of this explanation, but excuse me.
Again, I'd like to thank you for that very, very interesting presentation. If you'd like to know more about BELTA or about becoming a member, please remember to visit our website at www.beltabelgium.com. And again, don't forget about our upcoming BELTA Day on the 22nd of March at the Hub in Brussels. We have a great lineup. Jeremy Harmer will be there. Luke Meddings will be there. People coming in from Italy, Greece, Hungary. It'll be a great day. I'd also like to remind everybody that our next webinar will be on the 9th of March. Actually, a sort of maybe a follow-up to the one we had today. Johan Strobel, a local guy, will be talking about using corpora in the English classroom. So maybe he can help us find those chunks and fixed and semi-fixed phrases that we can use with our students to improve their fluency. So again, thank you very much, Hugh. I appreciate you giving up your afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you.
And if there's no other questions, then enjoy the rest of your Sunday. I know it's a beautiful day here in Belgium. I hope it is over there in England as well.
It's raining. What do you expect?
Oh, sorry about that.
There's no need to gloat.
Okay, thank you, everybody, and hopefully we'll see you on the 9th of March or the 22nd of March at the BELTA Day.
Thank you. You guys take care.
All right. Thanks, Hugh.
Bye.
Bye.